Hello! Welcome to the Killian Hill Professional Learning Community Trial period. Role play. We're going to try and work through a sample of the professional learning communities that we are going to be doing throughout this year. We have 4 different roles. I, Nicholas Brown, am the agenda keeper. Mr. Dawson is our content focus. Mr. Matt Lewis is our notes keeper and chiropractor, masseuse. Oh. And John Allen is our digital, I don't have a noun, guy, our digitizer. So I am going to be setting up the timer. I'm speaking loudly to make sure they can hear, so I don't want to mumble. So I'm going to be setting up the timer. Normally we'll do 30 minutes for a PLC, but for time's sake, we're only going to do 5-minute increments, and we have 3 different items we're going to discuss. So I'm starting the timer for our 5 minutes in just a second. Do you want to explain anything else before we jump in?
So this would be probably like the second time that our PLCs would be meeting during the school year. That's kind of the idea. Our first meeting during the school year will be a planning meeting. This one will be the second one where we look back and then look forward. And hopefully this will be a good example to you guys.
All right. I'm starting our 5 minutes now. First item, what evidence do you have that your students meet the standards you laid out for them? So standards, this is for last week, standards that hopefully you assessed in some way, shape, or form. What evidence do you have? Evidence, remember, we're looking for evidence, not just the fact that you covered it, but proof that you covered those standards.
I'll start. So the one that I had, this is in the chemistry standards. It says students will use tools and instruments for observing, measuring, and manipulating scientific equipment and materials. And so I had them complete this worksheet, and it looks like it's a measuring worksheet. And they're supposed to do some length measurements and some volume measurements. And they're also, in this one, supposed to pay attention to uncertainty and significance.
John, do you have a copy of your standard with you?
Yeah, it's right here.
Which standard was that you're looking at?
So it is Chem. This one is actually from the characteristics of science.
Okay.
And this is standard D.
Standard D.
Or standard
Okay.
4.
4. Okay. So tell me how your worksheet actually demonstrates, because that's really not them measuring something, it's just a worksheet. How do you connect that to the standard?
Yeah, so this is a follow-up to a lab that we do hands-on where they're doing these measurements, and I want to actually be able to see what each individual student is able to do. I'm not able to observe them all at the same time, so I have this worksheet as kind of an after hands-on assessment.
So this is kind of a formative assessment that
really
you're going to do
really
after the lab to make sure they kept up with that. Okay.
Great.
So then on your worksheet, you're marking that you have at least at one time this year you've addressed standard 4. Is it 4D?
Correct.
Is that right? So that'd be something that we would mark there. And what you're actually having to measure is what? Just
in this case, this is just length measurements and volume measurements using a couple different tools for each.
Okay.
All right, Matt, you have something?
Yes, so I was dealing with, in geometry, volume, surface area of 3-dimensional shapes. And so I realized right away that the students, this is 8th grade, the students actually had quite a strong understanding of the definition of volume and surface area, which I noticed is actually a 6th grade standard.
Go Kim Porterfield!
Kudos to the 6th grade teachers, and 7th grade for reviewing it. So I actually didn't have to spend very much time reviewing that. I was able to get right into the application of that because my standard that I used was the geometry standard 9, which says to apply the formulas for the volumes, cone, cylinders, and spheres, and then use them to solve real-world mathematical problems. So I didn't have to spend much time on the first part. I was able to get right into the real-world problems, like the volume of that's needed for a certain bird house.
Oh.
I thought you just stop at bird.
A bird, no, a bird house with the cube or rectangular prism and then the pyramid on top, etc.
Cool.
Cool.
Hey, what standard number was that? I was gonna record that one, so we have a record.
Yep, that was for 8th grade, and it was G9. So the whole thing was MGSE 8
Cool.
dot 9, dot G dot 9, so G9.
That's a hit.
Great,
And I'll put that on my notes as well.
awesome, cool.
Okay, I've got kind of an odd, and maybe not odd for what our teachers are gonna face. My biology standards and the content, they do not have an area that deals with biblical worldview, and yet the biology textbook starts out exactly there. So one of the first things I thought about doing was starting to try to put together an actual standard that's gonna address this. And so I just kind of stole their language and wrote down, students will analyze or assess the intellectual validity of a biblical worldview of science.
Nice.
So want them to, because the book starts at that point, that's where it begins. So now I won't be addressing any kind of a standard, but there are some characteristics that are actually gonna tie over to that I'm gonna find in that other section in science. It's gonna say characteristics of science. And then one of the other things we do in that first week is we're gonna introduce some things about the lab itself. And the Bob Jones curriculum does a really good job of letting people know that we still hold to science, we believe science is accurate, it's just the interpretation in relationship to your worldview. And so that has some good materials, that first lab. We teach them safety about using dissecting tools, and then we also have some follow-up. They have to use some microscopes. We give them a little microscope instruction as well, and then there'll be an area for them to fill out notes.
Awesome.
On that, and I'll check the notes to see if they understood the concepts.
Great, it's perfect. So really quickly, because I know the timer just went off, and normally you'd have 10 minutes to do this, so hopefully you won't be as streamlined as this. You'll be able to talk about it a little bit more.
I was going to talk about which standards it had, but that's okay.
No, actually, no, that's important
No,
though.
yeah,
In real meeting, I would make sure that I record which standards got met,
Right.
and I would get with Mr. Dawson so I could write down that new standard
Yeah,
that he
yeah.
proposed.
and John, are you,
Part of our list.
from what I just talked about and knowing that introduction, you'd agree that comes from that Bio CS2, where it talks about safety practices for laboratory and field
Yeah.
investigations, and then also
Great.
systematic process. It even talks about drawings a bit in there, so we'd be doing some things on standard 4 as well. So I'd be checking those items
Couple
off,
of them.
but it wouldn't be the only time I would do that standard. It would be done
Right.
throughout the course of the year.
I
Sorry.
have something similar to that though, because I have, what we would do for ours, the assessment is a discussion. I have an image here where I would put this up on the screen and I would have the students, all right, let's discuss this. And it's a semi-comic drawing of comforting lies and unpleasant truths in this big line behind the comforting lies booth. And it's the idea of cognitive dissonance, which we teach in social psychology, and that's connected to Leon Festinger. So one of our standards, AP Psych 14 Social, so it's close to the end, that's that last one. Identify important figures in social psychology, e.g. Solomon Asch, Leon Festinger, Stanley Milgram, Philip Zimbardo. So this would be one of those opportunities that they would be able to identify in this moment when I say cognitive dissonance. Now, I'll teach it relatively early in the week, and then I bring up this slide, and I say who is connected to cognitive dissonance, and they should be able to tell me Leon Festinger. So these students, we had a good group of students, and they were like, they got it right away, Leon Festinger. And so then we started to discuss, how does this picture connect with the idea of cognitive dissonance? And so the standard that connects to is discussing attitudes and how they change. So the attitude of cognitive dissonance, where I believe this, and my actions are this, and they don't line up, and so I'm going to tell this lie that bridges the gap. The example that I usually use, that I used this last week in psych, was, I know smoking is bad for me, yet I'm still smoking. What is the lie that I tell myself to make that okay? What is the comforting lie that I use that Festinger would identify? And so that's cognitive dissonance. So I'm hitting the discuss attitudes and how they change in social psychology. And again, this is close to the end of the list because the way I have set up psychology, I do social psych first because that really draws them in. So that's why I hit the standards close to the end, and then I back up and start from the beginning.
So that standard really didn't talk about a difference, when it talked about the change, it wasn't a change over time necessarily in this case. That applications is not just linked to just time.
Right.
Oh, okay, all right, that,
So it's that cognitive dissonance, some people, when they see that lie that they're bridging, that may cause a change, it may not.
Okay.
But it's part of that,
Okay.
that transition.
Yeah, when I heard you read the standard, I was thinking of something that, what they did when he first stated it and what people use now, but, okay, that helps explain that for me. Okay.
Yeah, so those are the standards, and again, so this is more of a formative, that I'm not, this is not where I'm giving them a grade, this is a discussion in class to see that they understand this concept. So moving on to discussion item 2, what do we need to help one another to build understanding of the standards? So once again, what do we need to help one another with to build understanding of the standards that we're working through right now?
So I had a question about one of my standards, so I have never taught the relationship of isotopes and relative abundance of atoms of a particular element. What are they trying to get me to do, and how do you think I could bring that into my class?
Can you read that again?
In English?
Something about,
What standard is
explain
it?
the, so this is chemistry, content, standard to, D. Explain the relationship of isotopes to the relative abundance of atoms of a particular element.
Okay.
Do you have any ideas for teaching, teaching that, or even really what they're trying to get me to do?
So are they suggesting that there are more isotopes or less isotopes that are available in nature to regular atoms?
So I think they're trying to get me to pay attention to, well, it says relative abundance of atoms of a particular element.
Okay.
Relationship of isotopes to the relative abundance of atoms.
Okay, so there's probably more atoms than there are isotopes.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
I wouldn't say chemistry is my best field, but
I'm a specialist in making stuff up, so no, I have no idea. It seems like the relative abundance as a term that they were using that would unpack, and I'm guessing connecting those two terms together.
So I probably need to do a little bit of research on relative terms before I'm teaching that next unit, the
Yeah,
relative
I guess.
abundance term.
Yep.
Okay.
Underneath this question, I did notice, I said there was a strength in the understanding of volume definition, which is standard for 6th grade, but another standard from 6th grade is they understand netting of three-dimensional shapes. I noticed actually that was a weakness in the student, so that's something I'm going to actually try to go back and try to align and just help the teachers elementary to maybe incorporate that a little bit more into their lesson and
That's good.
see where the disconnect is.
so John, and I'm just talking to John because I probably might be in the same room that he's in. I'm thinking about the lab. He talks about the correct protocol for identifying and reporting safety problems and violations. We've got some equipment in that room that I'm maybe not completely familiar with. Would you consider instruction on how to use the shower in that room as part of the safety protocol we probably need to go over in our class?
Definitely so.
Okay, all right.
Definitely so.
How about the use of the hood? Is that another thing that we might, maybe not for,
Yeah, so I haven't taught that to my students before.
Okay.
Maybe we should, though. Maybe suggesting safety protocols. Probably ought to make sure our students know all of the safety protocols for the room.
there's another thought I had about, if we're talking about safety, I've stored the dissection materials where students could probably get to them on their own. And that's something we should think about, or, I think that standard is addressing that, how we're gonna, if we're gonna leave them there, we have to have some kind of a standard to make sure, so I gotta make sure that gets in my notes, because that's not in my lab manual.
Yeah, always some good stuff that these standards are suggesting that I hadn't thought of before.
Is there a good place you can think of to look for that? Because it gives you, because these are things that just kind of came
Yeah.
up looking at the room, but
I know Flynn Scientific is pretty,
Okay.
they really kind of emphasize safety training, safety products. I've used some of their stuff before, but I'm sure they have more that I haven't thought of.
Okay, that helps, because I didn't know if I was covering everything or not.
So last thing, just what I'm working on with my standards. is one of my standards, especially in social psych, is talking about processes that contribute to differential treatment of group members, so like prejudice and ethnocentrism. I'm gonna see if I can connect with Dan Totten, if we could do some sort of joint project where we're writing about prejudice and ethnocentrism and bias. I know that weaves its way into a lot of the stories, the novels that he covers. So I'm gonna see if there's a timing that we could work together so that we could have a project that kind of cross-pollinates, where it hits some of my standards, some of his standards, and we could work together with that.
Who is this your one?
Dan Totten.
Oh, got it.
Have you thought about a survey that addresses, like bullying's a huge issue, that may have an application here? Is
That's a
there
great call.
some kind of, something we could do where teachers, maybe not in your class, are
Yeah.
collecting information and then it gets passed back to you?
And that ties really well into the research and methodology that I teach later on.
Okay.
So I could even branch. Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay.
I like that a lot. Okay, item 3, what standards do you want to meet next week? Standards that you want to meet next week. We have 5 minutes.
So the one that I started with was a characteristic of science, kind of an outlook or a scientific mindset, standard, scientific behavior. I'm going to focus this week on a content standard, and this is nomenclature, so the names of chemical compounds. So, and it says use IUPAC nomenclature for both chemical names and chemical formulas, and it's got 3 kind of areas: ionic compounds, covalent, and acidic compounds.
Okay.
So I'll try and teach that.
Cool. Matt?
Continued three-dimensional. I feel like they grasped the volume, so just now we need to work on more surface area, especially the netting and things. That actually, though, is not standard for 8th grade.
So why are you covering
But
it?
as
I'm just kidding.
But as I was reviewing, I realized that was just something that needs to be re-emphasized, reinforced a little bit. So I don't plan on spending the whole week on it, but at least half of the time.
Do you think you're gonna like fall behind in your normal scope and sequence plan track? Do you have enough flex?
I think I have enough flex
Okay.
to be able to do that, yes.
Okay.
So in moving through that chapter, I think it'd probably take me another week to finish up what's in there and what we do in our lab work. As I was looking at biblical worldview and then looking at the content, the characteristics of science, that's a part of my standard. It talks about evaluating the importance of curiosity, honesty, openness, and skepticism. And I think there's a good tie-in with that, with people of certain type of worldview. So if they've never heard, especially like our international students, with no concept of the deity, and then you're bringing this idea that deity made the world. I just think it's kind of, this is an area I'll probably move toward for next week, is make sure that in my instruction that I'm talking about the importance of curiosity and the importance of skepticism. It seems to be a good content area, and then we'll kind of make sure we touch on that throughout the year as we move on.
That's great. I'm just curious how you're going to assess that. Do you have a plan for that?
Yeah, that's going to be the difficult part, is coming up. So
Yeah.
normally my go-to is a formative assessment. I've got some kind of a battery of 3 or 4 questions, and I wouldn't try to cover all those in one. I would probably go to 3 questions and just talk about one of those topics, about maybe the skepticism part or the curiosity part, and get that back and get some feedback, and then when I come back to the next class, I'll know where they were on that. That's typically what I do if I'm looking for some evidence that they actually showed some curiosity in it.
That's good.
Cool.
That's good.
I love that.
So next week for me, I'm jumping into Milgram and his shocking experiments, so that connects with the similar. So what?
It's a fun.
It's a bad pun. It's one that I use aggressively and often. It'll go back to the standard of identifying important figures in social psych, because Milgram's one of them.
What's the number for that?
It's the very, very last one. The way that I have it printed off, it doesn't give me the actual number. It's AP PSY 14 SOC
Oh my word.
QR94 Batman symbol 66294.
Got it.
6.
Got it. Batman.
Exclamation point. So that one, and then jumping into explain how individuals respond to expectations of others. So groupthink, conformity, and obedience to authority. Those things are all connected directly to certain experiments. So Solomon Ash talked about conformity, and then obedience is Stanley Milgram and his shocking. So as long as someone's there saying, hey, no, just keep turning it up, these guys were turning up experiments that were eventually hypothetically killing someone, and they were just obeying, and so they felt like that was okay. The way I'm going to assess them understanding obedience to authority is through, again, a classroom discussion. Social psychology is really well assessed through discussion, where I start talking about the morality of things. I don't get too much into Kohlberg because he's much later, but to talk about why is this bad and how do you see this, identify this type of presence. When it comes to the important figures, I will put on my summative assessment, formative and summative assessment, I like to use a matching section where I have different psychologists, and then I'll just have a bunch of different details, concepts like conformity, obedience to authority, shocking experiments, the prison experiment, all these different ones, and they have to be able to connect them multiple times, so it's not just A to 1, you know, you cross them out, but it's like again and again, so that's how I'm assessing.
Have you thought about using, never mind.
Nope, go ahead, finish up.
Have you thought about using, since you use discussions in class, have you thought about putting like a free response kind of essay on the summative as well, to try to fit what you did in class
That's a great
with the
idea.
assessment? It might be worth 15 minutes of your test or 10 minutes of your test to do that.
Yeah, I try and build them so they're AP format similar.
Right.
I don't run 2 FRQs, I run 1 FRQ on each test,
Okay.
but I try and give them a couple of topics that I might put as the FRQ on the summative test. And so that
they
way,
prepare a lot, and yeah, I got
yeah,
it. Okay.
good suggestion, I like that a lot.
Great. So next week we'll bring some evidence that hopefully our students have been assessed over the standards that we plan to do this week, and we better head to class.
The children are coming! See ya!
I'll email this to you, John.